this slide. Welcome to my presentation on propaganda and how it influences Chinese American communities. Can you hear me? I'll talk louder. At its foundation, I'm examining how pro-Beijing propaganda will sway the public opinion within Chinese American communities. I think it's really important to acknowledge how China treats soft power because their strategic diplomacy differs from the West by a lot. They usually take more soft power into consideration, like subversion, like the incident with the cyber sabotage of the Indian COVID-19 vaccine, examples like that. And if you want to examine the bilateral relationship between America and China, I think it's important that you have to acknowledge the differing strategic plans and agendas from both sides. And I'm studying Chinese Americans in particular because I think it's a very fascinating subgroup. There's a lot of predisposition within these communities because of their ethnic heritage, their national origins. There's a lot of connections, personal connections between family. And so I think my hypothesis is that pro-Chinese newspapers and media will influence these Chinese diasporas a lot more than other groups, including other minorities or like African Americans, Latinas, etc. And so my research goal was just to use China Daily, which is a pro-Beijing newspaper that's funded 97% by Beijing. And the interesting thing about this newspaper is that a lot of the business transactions that it goes through isn't like your ordinary paper in the United States. So say the Houston Chronicle uploads a lot of their own articles and most of their revenue comes from subscriptions or advertisements with their own newspaper company. But China Daily actually spends a lot of funds on business contracts with other newspapers and other media in foreign nations. So China Daily is physically located in America, in the United States, but they have a lot of transactions with Brazil, for example, and a lot of cities like New York, DC, Atlanta, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is really interesting because they would pay money to those foreign media outlets and essentially put their own article into foreign media article, like newspapers, if that makes any sense. So for example, the New York Times had an article a few years back that basically was paid by China Daily, and it was written by China Daily reporters, but it was indistinguishable from the rest of the newspaper. It seemed like New York Times posted that and it was their own opinion. The contents were basically really optimistic about China, how China is funding all of these technological advancements in Africa, for example, and how they have a high-speed rail that's being built. But what the article doesn't mention, obviously, is that these are a lot of debt traps that are common in Beijing's strategic agenda. And a lot of these African nations are unable to pay it back and are further influenced by Beijing into other trade negotiations and stuff like that. And so that's the premise. And I wondered how these contracts with foreign media outlets, basically propaganda, disguised misinformation, would influence Chinese American populations. And so in my research, I basically made the Chinese American populations that were pro-Beijing synonymous with the readership of China Daily. So by doing this, I could accurately measure with like 90% confidence, 95% confidence that the constant readership and subscribers to the newspaper that's pro-Beijing actually holds the same political beliefs as the newspaper. Um, Obviously, I was limited because political sentiment is commonly traced by surveys and polls, but there's a lack of that in America, just because most people only study political sentiments of the American public or of Asian Americans, and they don't go as far down as Chinese Americans. So I had to like take another route to approach it. So it's not perfect, but I think it is a quite accurate representation. Um, and Here are the 11 cities that I studied. And basically, China Daily has contracts with 11 cities that are locally based. So basically, what I'm trying to say with this is cities like Houston, China Daily only has contracts with Houston Chronicle, which over 90% of their readership is locally Houston residents. So others like Chicago Tribune, those are also mainly funded and supported by the Chicago residents. And so with this information, I tracked it over 42 months from November 2016 all the way to April 2020. And this is the amount of money that China Daily spent every single month. This is only part of a portion of the amount that they spent, and you'll see why on the next slide. But over these 42 months in total, China Daily spent about $40 million over the 42 months. And so that's about 4 years, $10 million per year. And it's, for Beijing, it's an investment, right? They're not just throwing this money away. It's like strategically planned. And I think this is really clear. If you see San Francisco, they've spent the most money on San Francisco by far out of all the 11 cities. And this is significant because San Francisco isn't even one of the top 5 most populous cities in America. You have New York, right, which is like way lower in comparison. And then you have DC and Los Angeles and Houston. One of the most populous cities in America is farther down. I think it's in 6th place. And so to me, my theory is that they chose San Francisco and New York and DC because there are large swaths of Chinese communities in those areas. San Francisco in particular is a technological hub. It's an economic hotspot. You have a lot of political power in San Francisco, New York, DC. These are all like very important cities in America for like the flow of culture, the flow of like different trends. And also, because there are so many Chinese communities in these areas, you have a predisposition that's optimistic towards Beijing. So you have like a really good breeding ground, I guess, for propaganda to come in and sway it even further towards China. If you see like other cities, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, these are all very important cities in for like the American public, but you don't see it represented, or like you don't have business contracts in those cities with China Daily because it's just not important to Beijing, because there's not like a previous history of like communist influence in that region. And so they're investing in cities that work, basically. And I also really focused on how the newspaper China Daily is successful in this, because propaganda inherently uses symbols, political figures, political events, and repeated misinformation to change opinions or to influence political belief. And China Daily is a newspaper, right? All of these foreign outlets are newspapers. And so it's even more potent through those channels, because propaganda just works so well in combination with written word. And I also commented that propaganda is kept within the community because a lot of Chinese Americans consume Chinese media. And so sometimes it'll be indistinguishable from like independent media sources, and a lot of Chinese Americans will become reliant and think of this misinformation as fact. And so that's why I think it's more important, actually, to study Chinese Americans as a whole. And through my research, I've discovered that the heftier the investments of China Daily in a particular city, the more website traffic they got. And that also implies that there are more pro-Beijing supporters in that region, so that the investments actually work, basically. And then here's where they spend the rest of their money. A lot of these newspapers are also really significant, like the Foreign Policy, which is a really important journal in the political science field. Twitter, obviously, is shared by a lot of people in government. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times are all very influential outlets. But I couldn't lock them down by geography, which means to say that New York Times is read by people all over the world. It's not limited to just New York City, New York. Same thing with Washington Post. So I just thought it was like still important to have this data here, because it shows how much that Beijing wants to, or is willing to, invest to influence like public opinion in other countries. Yeah, over 97% of the funds are given by Beijing. Only 3.5% of the spending is supported by revenue and advertisements. On average, China Daily only garners $8,000 of subscription revenue per month, and they only have about $24,000 of advertisements a month. And so if China Daily was an independent media that wasn't subsidized by the Chinese Communist Party, there's no way they would have so much influence over foreign media outlets, which goes to show that Beijing is using China Daily as a weapon, kind of, as a soft power like channel, to say what they want to say and to be like the microphone to influence other people's opinions about China. And in conclusion, I think that it's really important to acknowledge the difference between Western democracy norms of political sentiment and foreign policy strategy versus China's, because in the West, we're more familiar with terms like moderate, liberal, conservative, and there's a range of political sentiment. But for the Chinese Communist Party, you're either pro-Beijing or you're anti-Beijing. And the closest analogy would probably be the Israel-Palestine conflict, where if you're an involved actor in that conflict, you're either for one side or the other. Often foreign media will be really impartial, but if you're actually involved, then it's really an ultimatum. There's not an in-between that you can choose. And this point is really important to remember. And I think in the future, I wish to study Chinese Australians because I think Australia and Beijing have a really interesting relationship. Historically, they've traded a lot. Geographically, they're closer together than Australia is to any of the Western democracies, save for New Zealand. And so I think it'd be really interesting to study how Beijing uses propaganda in Australia to influence the public opinion there. Thank you.